Hello and welcome again to the podcast. This is Evergrow and this is your host Dan Lalick. So today we're going to continue our lovely and wonderful talk about the Beatles. Now in our last episode, I briefly touched on the Beatles. Well, not briefly, in quite a extensive way I touched on the Beatles. But I really quickly touched on their breakup. I didn't want to get too much into it because this being the second episode is the second part of the Beatles, and this is where we're going to touch on really what happened after their breakup. I'm going to touch on where all the other Beatles went, how their solo careers went, and really what happened to the Beatles and caused them to break up and to go their separate ways. Now, in 1969, you have the group of the Beatles who are now collectively kind of already going their separate ways. You have John Lennon, who is now, in a relationship with Yoko Ono, and he is very much involved in being an activist against the war, and experimenting with drugs and trying to really find himself. He's trying to do what he can to break apart from the Beatles and not be in that little, I guess he would kind of call it this rut that he's in. Now at the time, their the manager for the Beatles, Epstein is he's just died. Now Epstein for the Beatles was probably one of the bigger parts of why they broke up. I mean, there's a lot of cogs that got that breakup going the way it did, but Epstein was a big cause for them. Epstein seemed to be this principal point to the Beatles. He, as much as each of these band members, was the Beatles. And with his death, the boys who are essentially the Beatles, they didn't have the ability to kind of manage their finances and manage a band. For them, they had just been artists and musicians and done their thing. And Epstein had always kind of been in the background, making sure that their money was allocated to the right place. He's the one who started them a company with Apple, not Apple Computers. It was Apple Studio, two different things. And that was to get to somewhat give them an umbrella for tax purposes, right? To kind of allocate money in other places to try and save them some money. So with Epstein dying, it really kind of... Oh, and by the way, before I get too far into it, Epstein passed away because of a complication from an overdose of a medication. So that's what caused him to pass away. Now, this started kind of this ball rolling to be what would end up being the Beatles breaking up. You got to remember that Lennon himself is kind of already kind of wanting to leave the Beatles. He's not as interested in what the Beatles are doing so much anymore. He's more interested in doing stuff on his own. So, with this whole breakup, I'm going to start with John Lennon. Now, John Lennon, when the band broke up, John, of course, is now with Yoko Ono, and he's going to start... Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. John Lennon's the first of the Beatles to kind of leave the band. John Lennon more privately leaves the Beatles before Paul McCartney more publicly leaves the Beatles. And once those two are gone, the Beatles are kind of broken up. Anyways, that being said, John Lennon leaves the Beatles, and he's now going to pursue making his own music. And he releases an album, which is a solo album, in 1970 called John Lennon and the Plastic Ono Band. Now, John Lennon and the Plastic Ono Band is a phenomenal album. If you guys ever get the chance to listen to it, I suggest you do. It's very, very raw. Now, it's after this point that John Lennon is really starting to hit his stride as an artist. The first album that he releases, which is, of course, John Lennon Plastic Ono Band in 1970, it kind of gets mixed reviews as much. It is an amazing album, but at the same time, some people just didn't kind of get where he was coming from, being such an activist and against the wars and all this stuff. You know, some people just didn't see his views. Now, in 1971, of course, he would have released Imagine, which is probably one of the more recognizable songs that anyone would know by John Lennon. They do play it on those commercials and stuff. But I mean, the song itself is very heart-wrenching, because it's about, you know, a world of peace and a world where all these terrible things that John Lennon is seeing going on around him, and what if they didn't exist? It really became like this message against anti-war. And John Lennon himself, it was so strongly against it that it would end up causing him a lot of problems in the coming years, which we'll kind of get on. Now, in 1971, John and Yoko moved to New York City. John releases the song Happy Xmas, War is Over, which is another song that a lot of people kind of instantly recognize. That being said, this is now when John and Yoko Ono are now taking kind of a stance against Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon is then taking a stab at John Lennon in the way that he is trying to get John Lennon deported back to England. He's not allowing John Lennon to be a resident of the United States. And that's going to go on, you know, for a couple years. It's not until about 1976 that whole issue is resolved. And that kind of plays a huge role on John Lennon, because John Lennon's very easily affected by things. He almost takes things too personally, or takes them too much to heart. And because of that, I mean, I can definitely relate. I'm kind of one of those people that it's like when people say things or when people do things to me, I almost take responsibility for their actions on top of my own actions. And that's very much like John Lennon, you know, where he has Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon has got this strong stance about, you know, being for the war and and Lennon's so far against it. And now Nixon is almost trying to punish him for his views by not allowing him to be a resident of the United States. You know, it's causing him to be depressed. And for how this conversation is going, you know, we've kind of discovered that when John Lennon gets depressed or really bothered, now he turns to drinking or drugs or it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy where he's hurting himself because he feels hurt inside. And I'm sure some of you can relate. And for him, it kind of gets him in trouble. he it's around this time when he ends up cheating on Yoko Ono, and Yoko Ono would then make a song called "The Death of Samantha," which is her views on how that kind of incident went down. And from there, there's kind of this. After John Lennon cheats on Yoko Ono, there's a real big division in their relationship. I mean, like most relationships would have, you get caught cheating, and there's some debt's going to have to be paid. You're going, John Lennon's of course sorry and regrets this choice or this stupid action of himself. But I mean, there's a lot of damage there, and that's right around the end of 1972, right into 1973. Lennon's recording Mind Games, and this is when him and Yoko Ono decide to separate, and they were apart for about 18 months or so. And Lennon often referred to this as his lost weekend, and that's where he spent time in both Los Angeles and New York, and he was kind of really engrossed in recording and writing, and because by this time John Lennon's also quite a gifted writer. This is about the time when John Lennon starts getting in a bit of trouble. In early '74, now he's gonna start hanging with Harry Nilsson. Now Harry Nilsson, Lennon would eventually produce Nilsson's album Pussycats, but at this time, John Lennon and Harry Nilsson are hanging out at the Troubadour Club, and they're causing just all sorts of trouble. John Lennon's getting really drunk and causing problems with the staff. They go there one night and they're heckling the Smothers Brothers. A lot of it is just nothing but trouble, debauchery, if you would call it that. Even the recording sessions were just chaos because he's just drunk and on drugs and just not really doing anything productive. Now, after this hiatus, this lost weekend, John Lennon returns back to New York. He records an album, Walls and Bridges, which has the song Whatever Gets You Through the Night. It features Elton John backing vocals and on the piano. It was the only single as a solo artist that John Lennon had that topped the US Billboard Hot 100 in his entire lifetime. It is a really good song. If you get the chance, you should listen to it. I'm a big proprietor of Elton John. I think Elton John is an amazing artist as well. I'll probably end up doing a podcast on Elton John. Elton John's huge advocator for gay rights as well. He'd be an awesome person to do a podcast on. So we'll probably review that at some point in time. Anyways, back to Lennon. Lennon then co-wrote Fame for David Bowie, which was David Bowie's first US #1. Now, it's at this point that John Lennon returns to New York, and in late 1975 has his first son with Yoko Ono, Sean. Now, this would be the second son for John Lennon, because John Lennon had a son with his previous wife before Yoko Ono. In 1963, I think, Julian was born. So Julian is his first son, and then Sean is his second. And at this point, John Lennon's going to fulfill his contractual obligations with EMI and Capitol, and then he's going to take a hiatus from the music industry. He's kind of become that kind of dad figure, and he's going to kind of more stay at home, do a lot more writing. And he does that for about 5 years. And in 1980 is when John Lennon is shot and killed. uh, John Lennon, if I remember the story correctly, John Lennon was at a function, ran into a fan by the name of Mark David Chapman. Mark David Chapman had a book written by John Lennon and got John Lennon to sign it. And then he returned back to the archway of where John Lennon lived. And when John Lennon went to leave, now there's differing stories. One says that he called out John Lennon's name. The other is that he didn't call out John Lennon's name. But either way, he turned and shot John Lennon in the back 4 times. Now, John Lennon, of course, was rushed to hospital and was declared dead on arrival. There's a really haunting recording of, I think it's Monday Night Football, where the color commentators actually get the news while on air and are informing everybody who's listening that John Lennon's been shot and killed. And it's just very, very sad. Now, John Lennon, of course, dies December 8th, 1980. This is a truly, horrible event, and John Lennon was taken from us way too quickly. You guys are welcome to look up more stuff about John Lennon. I really encourage that you do. He's really amazing, especially a lot of his writing. He was honored by the Grammys in 1991. He was also inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He is one of BBC's 100 Greatest Britons. He's actually number 8. And every year on December 8th, they hold a memorial for John Lennon on the anniversary of the day that he died. That's about it for John Lennon. I'm not going to continue to talk too much because I could really go on forever about John Lennon, but that would kind of make this podcast 7 hours long, and I don't think that you guys want to listen to me talk for 7 hours. But please take the time to learn some more about John Lennon and what he did and where he was as an artist. It was really tragic to see him die. Now we're going to move on to the next Beatle, and that's going to be Paul McCartney, the other half of the biggest chunk of what made up the Beatles' writing. Paul McCartney, to his credit, has been quite successful in his solo endeavors as an artist. So let's take a look at where Paul McCartney went after the Beatles. Now, after the Beatles broke up in the late 60s, early 70s, Paul McCartney had just gotten married to Linda. Linda being his first wife, and probably a woman he loved very, very dearly. We'll kind of touch on that a bit later. After the Beatles broke up in 1970, Paul McCartney then went and recorded his first solo album, which was just simply called McCartney. It was a US #1 album. From there, the next year he would then collaborate with his wife and a drummer he was an ex-Moody Blues. His name was Denny Lane. They would end up creating a band called Wings. For those of you who really aren't aware of what the band Wings is, I suggest you take a listen. I wouldn't say that it's personally my cup of tea, but you guys might like it. I mean, Paul McCartney is in it, so it gives it some street cred, so to say. But it's I don't know. It's a different band, that's for sure. But that being said, we're gonna move on here. Keep the ball rolling. In September of '71, Stella is born. Now Stella is the McCartney's daughter. Paul McCartney actually has quite a few children, so it's kind of really hard to grasp. I'm not going to touch on all his children. I think he has 5. Now, John Lennon continues to record with Wings for a good majority of the 70s. McCartney is involved with the band Wings. Right at the tail end of 1970, right about 1980 is when he then releases another album called McCartney 2. Then in the beginning of the 1980s, he collaborates with Stevie Wonder and makes Ebony and Ivory. And then after he collaborates with Michael Jackson with The Girl Is Mine. Now, this is where I believe that Michael Jackson really started getting a love affair with the Beatles' music. Paul McCartney, for all he's done for the Beatles, was really the only one of the Beatles that was very legally driven by what he did. When he left the Beatles, there was legal trouble, and when he wanted to get legal rights to things, he would always take the legal route first. And in 1985, Michael Jackson's going to buy an entire song catalog for about $47.5 million from ATB, which would include all the Beatles songs, all the Rolling Stones, Elvis Presley, and Bruce Springsteen. Now, Michael Jackson's going to own the rights to all those songs, which, I mean, for Paul McCartney must have been really rough to have songs that the majority of that were written by him and John Lennon were now owned by someone else. But into the late 80s and early 90s is when Paul McCartney's going to kind of stop. He's going to stop working with Wings. He's going to stop recording solo albums, and now he's going to focus on the Beatles themselves, and kind of getting that ball rolling as well, because he's such a big advocate for the Beatles and what they did and accomplished, which is, he's right to do that. They're amazing. Now in 1995, Linda's diagnosed with breast cancer. And I mean, for Paul, Linda's his entire world. And he's by her side every step of the way through cancer, and he becomes a big advocate for cancer research and I mean, Paul McCartney himself is such a, in my opinion, kind-hearted soul that it's, you know, it went far beyond just his wife being, you know, diagnosed with cancer. It was cancer on a whole, and he wanted to really be a voice for researching and curing cancer. I mean, but ultimately he would, Linda would lose her battle. The cancer would spread from being breast cancer and spread into her liver, and she would die in 1998. Paul McCartney absolutely devastated at this time. He was really unable to kind of cope. He wrote a tribute concert for Linda, and he was very devastated by it. You know, he kind of just kind of you could tell that it affected him. It was more than just to lose your wife, and for Paul to lose Linda, somebody that he was so devoted to and so involved with. It really had a strong emotional effect on him. Now, in the early 2000s, Paul McCartney would finally remarry, and he would marry Heather Mills. Now, the relationship between uh, Paul McCartney and Heather Mills was definitely an interesting one. Um, Eventually, they would divorce, and the divorce would be quite uh, hectic. Um, some say that the reason for the divorce was that Heather didn't get along with Stella, who was uh, Paul McCartney's daughter. Stella would say that she was jealous or evil or just a really bad person. And that would kind of come evident a lot during the divorce, which was quite highly publicized, where, Heather Mills is asking for $125 million. And Paul McCartney's offering her $15.8 million. And through the courts and all the stuff that ends up happening, by the time everything's said and done, Paul McCartney has to pay her $16.5 million on top of the 7, 8-ish million in assets that they had. Plus, he would have to pay her $35,000 for their nanny and school costs and so forth. By the time everything was said and done, she was gaining $50 million in US dollars. And I mean, it was such a gruesome divorce. And, Paul McCartney only grows as an artist through it. Um, there's so much to say about it. I really wasn't the biggest proprietor that Heather Mills was the best choice for him. But I mean, you got to keep moving somehow, right? You can't just stop living because, for Paul McCartney, I'm sure he thought that Heather Mills was going to be a great wife. Not to dive too much into Paul McCartney's love life and whatever. He would get remarried again to Nancy. But as an artist, he would continue to make music right up until today. I mean, in 2015, he collaborated with Kanye West and Rihanna to make that 4 or 5 seconds. He will be in the film, the new Pirates of the Caribbean movie. And at the beginning of this year, he's filed a suit against Sony and ATV Music, who had sold that song catalog to Michael Jackson, because he wants to regain ownership of the Lennon-McCartney song catalog and to have the rights to those songs. But as U.S. copyright kind of says, works published before 1978, the author can't really reclaim the rights to those songs. That being said, for my sake, I really hope that Paul McCartney really succeeds. I mean, for him and Lennon, who wrote those Beatles songs, I think no one is justified in owning them more than Paul McCartney. So that being said, we're going to move on to the third of our Beatles, which is George Harrison. Now, George Harrison, after the Beatles, would continue his own solo career, as most of the Beatles did. George Harrison went to create All Things Must Pass, which is a triple album. He got moderate success in recording. He was he would then go on to create a couple more albums. Living in the Material World was one of them. Then Dark Horse. And then in about 1975, he would record his last studio album, which was Extra Texture. Read all about it. After the murder of John Lennon, he would then really kind of be bothered by all the the stalkers and the people who had always kind of harassed the Beatles, even long after they stopped being the Beatles. Later in his career, he would make a band called the Traveling Wilburys, which is kind of a group project. In the late 90s, like 1997, George Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer. During that time, he really struggled with it, and it was hard on him. In the late 90s, I'm trying to remember, 1999, I think, George Harrison was attacked in his home. A gentleman had broken into the house, and if I remember the story correctly, the guy had broken into the house, and George Harrison kind of came upon him, and the guy had the kitchen knife, and he had stabbed George Harrison about 40 times. Like, it wasn't just like, just a once jab and then ran. Like, he just went to town on George Harrison. And when the police talked to George Harrison later on, George Harrison was quoted as saying, well, he wasn't a burglar, and he certainly wasn't auditioning for the Traveling Wilburys. I thought it was kind of funny that he had such a shrewd sense of humor in the wake of just being stabbed so many times. But sadly for George Harrison, cancer would finally take him, and he died in 2001, late November. It was quite sad. George Harrison, will forever be remembered, and had such a wonderful solo career past the Beatles. He was able to just kind of record music and good music that was, well topping charts well up until he stopped making music. We'll kind of touch on some more about these. Like, I know for George Harrison and Ringo Starr, theirs aren't going to be as long as the Paul and John's were, because Paul and John were more stronger members of the band than George and Ringo. Not to say that any one of them is more important in creating the Beatles than the other, because they really aren't. The only reason that George's kind of life story is considerably shorter than Paul and John's have been is just because there wasn't much drama. There wasn't as much things going on and things being poked at. George very quietly continued a solo career on his own, was successful at doing so, created a band with several other members, and it died. He was inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist, but post-mortem, after he had passed away. He died in 2001 and was given the award in 2004. But he's still, to this day, known as the Rolling Stones ranked 11th greatest guitarists of all time. So, think about that. For as little as George Harrison wrote for the Beatles, his talent when it came to playing guitars is almost unmatchable. There's very few people who can play guitar as well as George Harrison can. And anybody who's worth their weight in music at all, who can play guitar just like a ring and a bell, will tell you that George Harrison was an amazing guitarist. So moving on to our last of the Beatles, well, it's Ringo Starr. Ringo Starr, after the Beatles, he went on to do pretty much almost the same thing that all the other Beatles do. He had a solo career, made his own music. His first album by himself was called Sentimental Journey. And really from there, you know, for Ringo, he's gonna do some drumming for John Lennon. He's gonna do some drumming for Harrison. He eventually does some drumming for McCartney as well. He stays true to all the Beatles and loyal to them and helps them out. He creates a band which is called Ringo Starr and the All Stars. They create some albums as well. I mean, not to knock Ringo Starr, but his journey is very much like George Harrison's, where it very tamely and consistently is recording music and producing music. Um, he was on an episode of The Simpsons as well. In his in his time as a recording artist by himself, he produced, I want to say, 15 studio albums. Whether it was just himself or Ringo Starr and the All Stars. The All Stars have a new album coming out in 2017, which has been in the makings for probably about 25 years. Um, and he's going to continue going on tour as well. Unfortunately, I'm not going to get too deep into Ringo Starr. It's about the time where I'm going to start wrapping up this episode. Unfortunately, I didn't get too much of Ringo and George as I would have kind of liked to, but that's mostly because Paul and John are the stronger influences, and it have so much more to really touch on as far as artists and where they're going and what they're doing. And again, that's not to say anything bad about Ringo or George. Their solo careers after being Beatles were just really consistent, and they were producing very good, well put together music, and it wasn't there wasn't any real bumps in the road, kind of so to say. And because Paul and John were more the writers and the stronger influences, I kind of focused more on those, which is again no knock on Ringo or George Harrison. That being said, what I'm going to do is at the end of every episode, now that this Beatles one was kind of a two-parter where I did an episode that was about the Beatles themselves, and then one about the breakup. But what I'm going to try and do is at the end of the episode, I'm going to give you my personal 3 favorite songs by the artists that I'm talking about. Now, with the Beatles, my favorite songs by the Beatles, my 3 favorites are, let me see. Hey Jude is probably one of my tops. Then, it would probably be, what would it be? I really like, Come Together. The version that's done by the Beatles is amazing. And then probably She Loves Me. That's another great song. I mean, I could go on and on about songs that I like by the Beatles, but those would probably be my 3 favorites. And I suggest that you take the time to listen to the Beatles music. Spotify has a wonderful playlist that you can just follow and download, and it's called This Is the Beatles. And it has a really great kind of compilation of some of their older stuff versus some of their later stuff. And I really liked it. I listened to it quite a bit to get myself into the Beatles mode before I started recording all these, and it's interesting that after you've listened to the Beatles for a little bit, you can almost pick who's writing or who's singing and doing what in the band, and it's Very, very fun. Anyways, it's going to wrap up today's episode. Now, as usual, if you have any episodes you'd like me to talk about, feel free to email me at evergrowpodcasts@hotmail.com. I have a Facebook page that you can go to as well, which is Evergrow Podcast. After the release of the next episode, which will be next week, I'll be then uploading episodes onto iTunes as a podcast, and I will be trying to figure out how to put it on the Spoofy machine, and I will be putting it on my YouTube as well, so that I'm just kind of embracing all the medias to kind of really reach out there and let everybody know what's going on. It's been a pleasure making this episode for you. I'm very excited to make the next episode. I already know who it's going to be about. More current. What I'd like to do is go from an episode of somebody in the past, and then an episode of somebody more current, and then kind of switch back and forth. That way, when I'm making an episode for you guys, the first one's going to be something that's kind of in the past, and maybe you haven't heard of. Maybe you weren't even born when they were an artist. And then something very current that people are like, oh, I really like this band now. Where did they come from? How am I finding them now? A great example for that is I'd like to do an episode somewhat soon about 21 Pilots. I mean, 21 Pilots has been a band for a while, but is only kind of gaining some mainstream attention just now. And I find that really interesting how they kind of flew under the radar for a while, and now people are like, I really like 21 Pilots. But anyways, that's a fight for another day. It has been a pleasure making this episode for you guys, and I hope that you guys continue to follow and listen in the future, and we'll just keep exploring music together.